maybe when we go live, it'll behave itself. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Winterfest. We're live on UK Crime Book Club this afternoon, and I'm delighted to be joined by David Wake, Vaseem Khan, and Debbie Young, and we're going to be talking about cozy crime this afternoon. We do seem to be having a slight lag, so if there is a bit of a gap between me talking and the answering, we apologise, and hopefully it will sort itself out. It did last time, so shall I start by asking you one by one to introduce yourself and your books, and then everybody will know who everybody is?
Yep. Do you want any of us to go first? I mean,
yeah. Sorry, there was a big lag. Yeah. Do you want to go first, David? You're at the top of my screen.
I'm at the top, am I? I think I'm the newcomer to this group. I think the others are a bit more experienced. I've written a single cozy crime novel, but I'm such a fan of Poirot, Marple, and all the rest of it. So yeah, I mean, I can show you mine. The Murders of Conky Wallop, which is more a sort of pastiche of cozy mystery. Although I'm not making fun of cozy crime, I'm enjoying the genre. So that's me. I've written other books, but this is my first cozy crime. That's me.
Excellent. Vaseem.
Yeah. Well, first thing to say is thank you for inviting us on. Winterfest. I can't think of a better time than the season of goodwill for talking about murder. So I've written quite a lot of books. My first series was Cozy Crime. So my first series began with this book about 10 years ago, The Unexpected Inheritance of Inspector Chopra. And it's a series set in modern India, in Mumbai, or Bombay as it used to be known, about a middle-aged policeman who retires in his late 40s, has to solve murders and things. But he also has this intriguing dilemma of inheriting a 1-year-old baby elephant, which he then has to look after throughout the course of the series. He's a serious man. The elephant doesn't fly, doesn't talk, it doesn't solve mysteries. It's a symbol, it's a metaphor for India, because although I was born and grew up in the UK, I lived in India for 10 years. And honestly speaking, I wrote that book and I had no idea that that anybody would be mad enough to publish it, but it was published by a big publisher. It's translated into 17 languages, and it became a bestseller. It basically gave me a career as a writer, and so I wrote four more books in that series. I don't really like the term cozy crime, but we can come back and discuss that a bit later, I think. And my other series we can discuss later as well.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Debbie. Yes, I've been writing cozy crime for 7-8 years now, and my first series is the Sophie Sayers Village Mysteries, and that was the book that started it all, Best Murdering Show. I live in a little Cotswold village and with a wonderful village show, and that's what set me off on the path, that following on from a lifelong love of all the traditional golden age of detective writing and Sherlock Holmes and Dorothy Sayers and all that sort of thing. So that's the 9th book in this series. Will be published by Boldwood Books in January, and that's called Driven to Murder. About the cancellation of the local bus service. I address lots of rural issues. It comes from a place of affection and love of a good rural community and of the Cotswold landscape in which I live. But I have terrific fun, and it's very light-hearted in a way. My other series is set in a girls' boarding school called St Bride's, and this is the first in the series. And the 4th in the series was published by Boldwood Books this year, called Artful Antics at St Bride's, and that's set in a boarding school. So you immediately think, oh, Mallory Tale, St Trinians, all that sort of thing, but it's actually about the staff, about the teachers. So it revolves around the staff room rather than around the girls, although the girls feature too. And there's no murders there, because I didn't want to have murders in the school, but there's lots of mystery and intrigue and double-crossing and so forth. Lots of humour in both, a romantic element in both as well. And basically I'm writing the kind of book I like to read and having terrific fun doing it. And I also write shorter stories. And my very latest book is Christmas with Sophie Sayers, which is not a murder, has no crimes at all, but it's just featuring, it's a spin-off really from the Sophie Sayers British Mysteries. So that's me.
Excellent. We'll come back to Vaseem's point about cozy crime as well, because how important do you think? I think setting is really important, and you sort of all touched on the settings, the different settings in your books. But how important do you think setting is in a crime book, whether it's cozy crime or normal crime?
I think the setting readers expect the setting to be almost as interesting as the characters. I think it should be a place where that intrigues people, that makes them want to visit there or even live there. And I think they're all part of the charm. And they have to be appealing places. I can't think of any cozy crime places which are set in awful places. Any cozy crime books set in awful places. The settings may have their faults. I mean, obviously in Vaseem's you've got the poverty and all that sort of thing, and corruption, but it's part of the plot. But there is also this huge affection for India and Vaseem's great love of India and all things Indian, which is quite infectious. And I think the setting should infect the reader with the writer's enthusiasm for the place that they're writing about.
It's a character in the story of its own right, and also it's escapism, isn't it? I don't want to escape to somewhere next door to where I live. I want to go somewhere exciting or interesting.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for those kind words, Debbie. Look, I grew up in this country, and I got the chance to go to India, which was where my parents were from, at the age of 23. And honestly, this was back in 1997. And you get out of the airport, and it's like being hit in the face with a frying pan, because you've got the heat, you've got beggars, you've got lepers, you've got eunuchs, you've got things that you just cannot see in Britain. And that was just on that first drive from the airport to the hotel. I saw an enormous grey Indian elephant in the middle of traffic. You don't see that unless you've had a few too many on a Friday in the pub. That was a genesis for this first series of mine. For me, I think it's about, I've had a long time to reflect on what it is that makes people want to read books. I'm a lifelong reader, like all of us, first and foremost. I personally think that we like to be taken out of our lives. We like to be put into situations and places that we perhaps don't know a great deal about, but which intrigue us. And so many of the readers that I have are actually Western readers. I mean, I sell a lot of books in India, but I sell so many more in Britain, in Australia, in America, and I get mail from all over the world. And people say, I've always wished to go to India, or I had grandparents who were stationed in India. And, I've seen so many depictions of India in Slumdog Millionaire and The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, but they're always very, we tend to make them nice and clean for everybody, and everybody's happy. And even if you live born in a slum, you win the lottery and live happily ever after. Well, no, you don't. If you're born in a slum, your life is shit, and it's going to be relentlessly shit until you die, most probably. So I write cozy crime, but the reason I said earlier I'm not so keen on the term perhaps is because I think there's a fine balance that you can find in cozy crime where you show some of the darker aspects of whatever setting, whatever world, whatever characters that you're dealing with, and you can use the humor and the gentle side of cozy crime to offset that darkness without going so tweed that it becomes something that is perhaps slightly on the other end of the spectrum to the spectrum of cozy crime that I write.
Yeah, I think even writing about the Cotswolds.
No, I think that's really interesting. I think the sort of the.
Sorry, I've got a delay going on. I was going to say an answer to.
You go.
Even writing about the Cotswolds, and people will say to me, "Oh, I'd like to come and live in your fictitious village of Wenterbury Barrow." I think it's really important to draw out the darker sides, the sadness and the deprivation that you can get with rural poverty, rural loneliness. My latest book is about the cancellation of the local bus service, which then immediately changes so many people's lives for the worse. And so the same principle as what you're trying to do, Vaseem, in your Indian books, I'm trying to do with the Cotswolds as well. I'm trying to draw people's attention to the darker side, while also I think people expect a happy ending in cozy crime. I think you have to have justice done. You have to have the detective triumph and the villains punished, because I think there's a reader expectation that it's going to end well for all of those, apart from those who are killed or the perpetrator. So I think you have to be careful with expectations. But I also think that cozy crime is a little bit glib as a term. I was once doing a book signing in a shop, and an elderly lady came up to me and was asking what I write, and I was trying to explain cozy crime to her, and I was saying, they're just nothing gruesome, they're just sort of nice murders. And she said, "My dear, there's no such thing as a nice murder." And I thought, that put me in place, It's absolutely right,
I don't think there's a problem with the name. I don't object to it, and I also, there's a spectrum, but on the nice fluffy end, they're puzzle books, aren't they, really? And I think Agatha Christie, for example, and people of that era were reacting to sort of the horrors of the First World War and didn't want gruesome murders and those sort of horrors. So they were trying to package it up neatly and nicely, and I think there's nothing wrong with that. Again, there's nothing wrong with doing darker things if you feel like it.
Yeah.
And I think the intellectual puzzle side is really, really important. I read somewhere that in the 1920s, when the golden age of detective writing was really taking off, so was the crossword puzzle. Suddenly everybody was mad about crossword puzzles. And I think that's also part of the post-war thing. And I think that's another important element of cozy crime, is that there has to be a puzzle there that the reader can solve. And it goes back to the 10 golden rules, that you must have all of the clues in there somewhere, as many red herrings as you like, but you've got to equip the reader so they have at least remember the chance of solving the puzzle, even though you also try and make it really difficult for them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think also the characters as well, haven't they? Your characters are so fundamental to the characters, whether it's the lead character like yours, Vaseem, with you've got your inspector, you've got you and Debbie have both written series, so you've got that ability to develop the characters as well, but then have the sort of add-ons that you can have in each book. I was really interested in yours, David, because you have three sort of Miss Marple-esque figures. So how important, when you were sort of thinking about your character or your main character, how sort of important is it for them to be sort of a bit nosy, a bit inquisitive, all of those things? How important is their sort of character to the book?
I think if your main detectives were not nosy and not curious, nothing would happen in the book. They have to sort of want to solve the case, don't they? I suppose your Inspector Morse characters, it's their job to do it. But on the amateur sleuth end, it has to be curiosity. I think the characters have to have certain elements to do any kind of detective work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that cozy mysteries often get badged in a particular way because they conjure up an image in people's minds about the characters, about settings, etc. But I think you can subvert the genre. I mean, the three golden rules are, of course, that there should be no gruesomeness, no bloodletting, no swearing, and all the sex should be off stage. It's not that people aren't up to no good, but yeah, we don't want to see it. Thank you very much. But you take my series. There's no female busybodies, which you often see often see in Cosy Crime. Chopra is a middle-aged, very dour policeman who takes himself and the world and the crimes that he's investigating very seriously. He's sort of the straight man. The elephant is like there for a bit of like relief. There's no quaint village with dark undercurrents. It's Bombay, and Bombay's got 20 million people. I mean, unless you've been to a place like Bombay or Mumbai, as it's now called, you can't imagine how raucous an environment that is for anyone to operate. And the police environment that he's just left. So he's not an amateur. He's a policeman of 30 years standing who in his late 40s is forced out. But he can't let go of that desire to see justice, especially when it's in the first book. It's a poor guy. And in India, unfortunately, the truth is that if you're poor and unconnected, normally you don't get much in the way of sort of law enforcement looking after cases of that nature. And that's always bugged Chopra. And so he's been fighting against this kind of environment his whole life. And just because he's lost his uniform, he doesn't feel that he shouldn't. So I think you can do lots of things, but I think, yes, you're absolutely right. The character is what sustains a series, because we fall in love with characters as readers and we want to spend more time with them. And that's why crime fiction, you see so many series, because people just want to revisit. And if you take something like Agatha Christie's books, I mean, I write a lot of stuff about Golden Age crime fiction because of my second series. Not every plot stands up to scrutiny over time. Not every one of her 50 or 60 plots. But because we love the characters, we love Poirot, we love Marple, we're willing to forgive the odd plot hole because we just want to spend more time with the characters.
Yeah. I think it's quite an interesting contrast between my protagonist and Vaseem's, because Vaseem's got a early retired policeman who knows everything about crime, and he's looking at the world expecting to see crime because he knows it's really there. But in both of my series, the protagonist is the newbie. So a young woman moving to a new environment, whether it's a village or as a teacher to the boarding school, and they're having to learn all about their environment, so that it's necessary for them to explore the environment and start looking for strange things because of being new. So it's kind of the polar opposite in a way to Vaseem's. But Sophie in particular, and Sophie Sayers, she has never lived in the little village. And again, that's polar opposite to the huge sprawling Bombay. She's living in this tiny village where everybody knows everybody else and everybody else's business, whether you want them to or not. And she's not used to that, but she's primed by her ex-boyfriend before she moves there that it's going to be a classic village like one in Midsummer Murders, where people are murdering each other and burying each other under the patio and all that sort of thing every 5 minutes. So she's sort of looking for crime where there isn't any, but she does also find some that the others are just missing. And so she has that point of difference with the other people around her that makes her a particularly good detective.
And David, how did you come about with your characters?
How were they created? There's an odd story about it. I went to a sort of family meals in Cambridge, and people found out I was a writer, and you always get that, oh, what about this plot for a story? And these two wonderful art figures were telling me, oh, what if you found some evidence that was handed into an Oxfam shop? And then it became a running joke. They kept suggesting it every time we had a meal. And eventually, just to keep them quiet, I had to write the book. So in a way, I started with them and changed the characters as the setting and the situation required. So it's not them, but that was the jumping off point.
Are they happy now?
Yes.
When you have your meals, are they?
Yeah. They just keep asking me for the next one. Forever. But it was a nice way to do it, and you need to start from a small place and expand out from that.
I'm in a funny situation because living in a village very much like the one I'm writing about, I've lived here 32 years, although I'm in London originally. I've lived here 32 years. I've been on every committee going, very active in village life. So I'm in the village choir, I'm a bell ringer. and people keep suggesting to me different ways to commit a murder now. So every time I go to bell ringing practice, people say, "Well, kill them this way with a bell." You know, it's quite scary, really.
Yeah.
Very helpful.
I get that. People suggest ways for me to kill people with elephants. No, the only people who've ever killed elephants were the Mughal emperors. So the Mughal emperors had, if you pissed off the Mughal emperors, what they used to do was they used to bring you in, arrest you, bring you in, put your head on a block, and then get the royal elephant to crush your head with its feet. Yeah, it's a tried and tested form of execution in the Mughal.
That's not very close to crime, is it?
It's not something I can really build into a contemporary mystery, really.
No. You mentioned it, Vaseem, about that you didn't know that you were going to write a series when you started, and does it make it easier or more difficult? I guess you've written other things as well. So is it easier to write a series, or is it harder because you have to remember what you've said so far and go back?
For me personally, I find it very much easier than trying to reinvent the wheel every book. But also, I think as writers, you get to know your characters, you get feedback from readers, you know what's working, you know what's not working. But also, it's about what you're trying to say as a writer. What is it that you want to tell people about the world that you're describing? And for me, it was always the fact that I'd lived for 10 years in this amazing place that was undergoing incredible change from being a almost pre-industrial economy to the near global superpower that we think of India as today. And I wanted to, I said earlier, we're guilty of mythologizing India, turning her into a land of swamis and snake charmers. And it horrifies people when I talk about this on stage that Indians don't get up and dance in choreographed numbers every 5 minutes and the rest of it. So I want to try and depict a very realistic India, but to use crime fiction as the vehicle, because I think it's always more fun to learn about something when you're being entertained. So with each of these books, I try and pick a theme and then stick to it. Let me do some more book waving. So the 5th book in that series, Bad Day at the Vulture Club, right? I love that title because it's about the only title I've ever been allowed to keep by my publishers. So that's about the murder of a Parsi gentleman in Bombay. Now, the Parsis are a very wealthy, very small community of Bombay. Freddie Mercury was a Parsi, just in passing. And they're very unique in India because they don't bury or cremate their dead like Muslims and Hindus. They leave their dead out on these stone towers called the Towers of Silence in the middle of Bombay for vultures to eat, because they're Zoroastrians and vultures are holy and sacred in the Zoroastrian religion. And this has been going on forever. But the problem is now that when the Towers of Silence were originally built, there was loads of space around them. But now you have these great big towers on all sides with people on balconies eating their lunches. And the vultures sometimes pick up. They like to take snacks away because they can't finish the whole body. And they sometimes drop. So you end up with people who've had bits of desiccated toe falling into their morning breakfast bowl. And so there's a huge litigation going on in Bombay now with the people in the towers trying to get the Towers of Silence moved aside. And there's Parsis rightly saying this is holy ground, we're not going anywhere. So I thought it would be fascinating to bump off a very rich Parsi and then have Chopra and his little baby elephant going around trying to solve it. So, it's those kind of things that I think feed into what you're trying to say about a particular place or characters.
That's
I think you touched on it as well about it's always really fascinating to be able to find out about places. Sorry.
Carry on.
Sorry. It's like knowing where the lag ends and where we have to start. I was going to say it's fascinating to be able to go to different cultures and lands and places that, so you might be, I think the village is very sort of quintessential because not everybody can live in a village. I live in a village, so I know that sort of small village mentality, but being able to transport your readers to India where, a lot of people will never go is absolutely. You're full of facts, aren't you, Vaz? I've got so many. Sam's just said you can always count on Vaz for a surprising fact. So thank you for those. I love them. I love a fact. So keep bringing those on. I've got some comments on the feed as well, saying given its popularity, Laura's saying given its popularity, should the cozy crime genre have its own dagger at the CWA Awards? And then we've also got Sarah saying she thinks they should have a cozy crime panel at book events. So that's just some thoughts that are coming in from, sorry.
Okay, well, I am the chair of the CWA now. The CWA, for those who don't know, is the Crime Writers Association. It's 70 years old. It's the oldest and largest association of crime writers in the UK. And I was very honoured to become the first non-white chair this year. And my first action was to introduce 2 new daggers, including a dagger for cozy crime. So that's box ticked.
Excellent.
It'll be launched next year.
Well done. Yeah, that's going in there, sorting it out, and getting on with it right away. Well done. That's amazing. There you go, Laura. That's ticked. Done. I think I can't remember. Sam or Kaz will remind me, but I don't know whether we are having a panel at our UK Crime Book Club for Cozy Crime. Whether we had one last year, I'm not sure. I can't remember. But yeah, I was talking about the popularity of it. Do you think that, because it's definitely having a renaissance, isn't it? Everybody always loves Agatha Christie, and we've always sort of gone back to those, and they were the first adult books I think I read. Whereas now young adults have got so much choice with reading. I wonder whether a lot of it is nostalgia because people are going back and rereading them again and they want more because they know that they give them that feeling. Or do you think it's something else? Do you think there's something, worldly that's happening that wants us to gravitate back to that sort of cozy, not so brutal murders?
I think it's actually never gone away. It irks me a little bit when people say, "Oh, Richard Osman, he's caused the rise in cozy crime popularity," but no, he hasn't. He's caused the surge in sales of Richard Osman's books. And there are always more people jumping on the bandwagon, but it has always been there, and all through the 20th century and all through the current century, it's always been really popular. It's the kind of book that it's the kind of genre people will read and reread. And the older books, from Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie, and all the ones that are being published by the British Library Classics now, the very early detective writers up to the modern day, people have been reading those and rereading them ever since, and they do bear rereading. You just have to leave it long enough so you've forgotten who done it each time, and whether you're reading the older ones for the period pieces, Dorothy L. Sayers is one of my favourites, and they are just wonderful period pieces as well, and so interesting, or whether you're reading a very modern one or in between. And there's a lot of modern people writing about sort of 1920s, 1930s, 1940s as well, and I think it's always been there, but I think maybe people are talking about it more now. It's sort of become more respectable to read, perhaps, or seen as less of a soft option.
Yeah.
Also, all of the world events of the last decade, really, COVID, Brexit, all the awful things that we don't want to talk about, they are comfort reads in all of those circumstances. And when you see terrible injustices happening in the world, it's lovely to get stuck into a cozy crime where justice will be done, even if it's only in fiction.
I think they're puzzle books. Very, very strongly think so. And someone mentioned earlier that when Agatha Christie started writing, crosswords became popular. Yeah. So maybe setting it in an English village gives you that grid pattern that you're familiar with, within which to put the puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely agree with both those sentiments. I mean, the world is, you just have to, I'm scared, I'm terrified of turning on the news now or going onto social media, because it literally is like punched in the proverbials from 100 different sources. It's just not nice, is it? So to be able to get lost in a book. But those books, I mean, Cozy Crime, again, the deceptive nature of the title, they are about murder, essentially, most of them, anyway. So it's not as if you're not dealing with dark topics, but it's done in a way where, as Debbie says, justice will happen. It's about the journey, it's about the characters, it's about the setting, it's about learning things, and it is intrinsically about the puzzles and the clues and the red herrings. So now we sometimes interchange. So I'm going to quickly introduce my second series. So this is Midnight at Malabar House, which is the first of my historical novels set in 1950s Bombay, which are more in the golden age tradition, and we use interchangeably traditional golden age cozy crime. They're not quite the same, but they're close enough, because again, there's no sex, there's no swearing. Well, there is, but it's all off stage, and the bloodletting, and it's much more about the characters and the puzzles. So with these books, I mean, they're set just after Indian independence, and 3 years after Gandhi's assassination and the horrors of partition, but also just a few years after the British have left, after 300 years on the subcontinent. And that was a relationship that ended badly, like a bad divorce. But it started off quite well, because the first explorers from Britain, from the East India Company, that went to the Mughal courts in the 1600s were actually quite, they were there for trade. They learnt the local language. They often ended up marrying Indian wives. And there was this real feeling of trade. And obviously things went to go pear-shaped when Clive of India, etc., and it's turned into more of a conquest, and then it became the Raj, etc., etc. But what always amazes me, so I was taken to India by my boss in England, a lovely snowy-haired gentleman called Terry Brewer from Kent. And after about 3 months in India, he turned to me and he said, "What's going on? Why are these Indians always happy to see me every day? I mean, don't they know what my ancestors did here?" And I said to Terry, I said, "Indians are too busy moving forward with their country. It's supercharged. They're moving forward. So they don't have enough time to go back and have a look." So that's what I do with that series, the Malabar House novels, because I have that balanced perspective. I grew up here, but I lived there and my heritage is from there. I can talk about that British period during the Raj and just after the Raj, the post-colonial period, in a way that perhaps middle-aged white historians, who are lovely, many of my friends, they have a view of the Raj which is perhaps different to the way Indians view the Raj. For example, the Indian mutiny that we call the Indian Mutiny is not called the Indian Mutiny in India. It's called the Indian Rebellion, and it's celebrated as as an achievement of the first attempt to get rid of the British colonizers. Whereas here, we were often taught in school that it was the mutiny that had to be suppressed because of these dodgy Indians daring to ask for freedom.
I've written a book set in the British Raj, and I should have used you for research.
Well, I do use a lot of middle-aged white historians for research as well, I have to say. So
Yeah.
I'm not looking middle-aged white historians at all.
That leads me nicely on to my next question, which is about research, actually. So how, obviously, when you start your your next new book, and you start the process of where you're going to go with it next, how do you do the research first, during? How is that process part of your writing?
I don't really need to do research to start my stories, because I'm living in a village and I'm writing about where I'm living, and I've worked in a boarding school for 13 years, so I don't need to do like research for the setting or whatever. Although I will occasionally hit upon a point of detail, like there's a scene where a body is found in an open grave, and I went down a little rabbit hole investigating grave digging, which was actually really interesting. And I've got some shorter books that I've written as well. This one, The Clutch of Eggs, which is a little novelette, and that was actually inspired by the research came first and inspired the story idea. I went to an exhibition at Bristol City Museum, which was about birds' eggs and the illegal collecting of birds' eggs and birds' nests. And I ended up reading quite a lot of books about birds and birds' eggs before I started that. But that was really the exception for me. But it's nice when you find a little, like you were saying earlier about liking interesting facts that are woven in, but of course they have to be woven in well with the story, so you don't feel like you're suddenly getting a lesson. But it's nice when that happens occasionally. But with the kind of thing I write, and I'm writing all contemporary as well. So my research is going to building and practice, going to quiet practice, and all that sort of thing. Just living my life,
I think you do research because all the time, because you're interested in something, and you read a book about it or you watch a documentary. and you don't realise that it is research, but sooner or later it will percolate through the brain, and out will come an idea. And then when you're writing a book, you'll hit a snag and think, oh, I know nothing about this, I need to go and look it up. But we're also writers, we just make it up as we go along.
I think we're all observers as well, aren't we? And I mean, particularly on the comedy, my comedy is sort of observational comedy. But you're just earwigging on conversations and things all the time, aren't you? And watching little interchanges in shops and bus queues and all that sort of thing. And that, I guess, that's all sort of research by osmosis. You just absorb interesting, stimulating ideas wherever you're going. But Vaseem, your books, particularly your historical ones, clearly need a lot more research. Need serious research.
Yeah, I take about 3 months to do the research, because I need a lot of historical research, which I then have to distill out and find what are the most relevant things to this book and what are the most interesting things. But I also have quite complex plots, usually 2 strands going on at the same time. And it's about what is it that I'm trying to say. I think for me, I use this term historical correctionism, because one of the reasons I write these books is to try and shine a light on things that I think people would be interested to know about India that they don't already know, that they haven't seen in Slumdog Millionaire or whatever. Simple example, fingerprinting. We're crime readers, we love the idea of fingerprinting, but the fingerprint classification system was actually invented in India, in Calcutta, by 2 Indians. Yeah. But it was not named after them. It was named after their supervisor, Henry. So it was called the Henry classification system. It was then transported to Scotland Yard, and from there around. And we basically still use very much this similar system today. But it's not that Henry was an evil man. It was just that the way that things were done there, that the British supervisor would get the credit for your work because he had enabled the work to happen. So small things like that, I think, for me, are quite important to seed throughout. And those are the things that I get the most mail about from around the world, with people saying, I thought I knew a lot about India, but I did not know that. And that's always gratifying when that happens, I think.
So you're driven by wanting to correct these things. That's a driving force.
Yeah, that would be a fair... but I mean, I'm trying to be balanced. Do you know what? This is a good point to wave this around. So this is the latest book, the 4th in the Malabar House series. It's called Death of a Lesser God. And when I say I try to be balanced, so this book is about a white man who was born and raised in India, James Whitby. So he's effectively Indian, but he's convicted of murdering an Indian nationalist lawyer. And he's got 11 days left before the Indian government hangs him in 1950. And then Persis works with an Englishman named Archie Blackfinch, who's a forensic scientist, who is in Bombay to help the Bombay police set up their own forensic science service. So he's another character throughout the series, and they work together. So they end up from Bombay to Calcutta, trying to figure out whether or not James Whitby is guilty. But that book really inverts the whole narrative of colonialism on its head. And it asks the question, can post-colonial societies actually be fair to their former colonizers? Because people like James Whitby, they're born and raised in India. They don't want to go back to England when India became independent. He's not known any other country really, except for periods of education. So that's his home. So why should he go back to England? Why should we be driven out? And so they're difficult questions that I think sometimes that the research throws up. So I didn't know a lot about that until I did the research, and I found that there were people like this who'd stayed on after independence, white Brits who just didn't want to go home, and who had to navigate this new reality of no longer being the masters and being able to call the shots.
That's very interesting. Last year I read Satnam Sanghera's Empire Land, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. Highly recommended. But I also felt quite ashamed to be British at the end of it in some respects, or certainly in certain passages of it. So it sounds like I should need to read your book now, to your series, Malabar House series, as the antidote.
Yeah, I think I often say this, that I don't think there's any reason for people to be ashamed, because we can't control history. The Mughals weren't exactly super friendly to other people, and every empire's gone around killing people. There's a great 3-part documentary on Julius Caesar the other day, and we venerate Caesar almost, but he murdered 1 million French people. And I have French friends. I don't want to think of people murdering French people. So I often say that not every Brit who went to India was a sinner, and not every Indian was a saint. And what I mean by that is many Brits went to India not to conquer, but because they were told there's a great job in the Indian civil service, you can make a career. And when partition happened and 1 million Indians killed each other, it wasn't the Brits who were doing the killing, it was Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs killing each other. So balance, I think, is quite important to me because I have experience of both cultures.
I'm just I'm mentally going through my own book.
What's your, what would you say your favourite?
Oh, I was just saying, I'm mentally going through my British Raj book thinking, oh, have I made a mistake or something?
Right. Sorry, I was going to say, what would you say is your favourite part of the writing process? Would you say it's the idea? Would you say it's the development? Would you say it's the end? You know, what would be what's your sort of, when you sit down and you're thinking about writing your next book, what's your sort of, what do you look forward to?
Personally, I like just the writing the first draft. I plan reasonable amount, so I know what's going to happen. I have maybe a paragraph per chapter, so I know roughly what's going to happen. But then a lot more creativity starts happening when I'm writing. I write the first draft non-stop. You know, I don't go back and edit. And I find myself laughing at my own jokes and things that the characters say that I wasn't expecting, and little plot twists that just sort of tumble out. And that's the exciting bit. And then the really hard work starts when I have to go back and edit and edit and edit and edit before it goes off to my editor for the official editing. So it's the initial storytelling. That's the fun bit. Although I like perfecting the language and the plot and so forth as well. Just letting the story happen and almost watching it unfold is the best fun for me.
I would agree. When the characters start doing their own thing, and you're just, you know, your fingers are moving, but it's a surprise when it turns up on the screen. That's lovely.
I think for me, it's the humor. So I, like Debbie, use a lot of dry humor, observational humor. And I do that because I'm talking about lots of dark topics. I mean, partition, 1 million people died. It's very hard to joke about partition. You wouldn't joke about the Holocaust and you wouldn't joke about partition. So, but I need something to alleviate the darkness. So that in Midnight at Malabar House, the partition forms the backdrop of the plot. So I try and use observational humor. And often, you know, I'll have written a line and I'll be sniggering myself, and my wife will walk in on me and say, you know, have you lost your mind? Why are you laughing at your own jokes? That's so sad. It is sad. It is sad, but it's not that sad because, you know, once you get to the editing process, you might find that it sticks and it helps. It helps to balance out what are, you know, we're talking about cozy crime. That's one of the distinguishing factors, I guess, of cozy crime. You have a note, often a gentle note of humor that runs throughout. And even with Poirot, Agatha Christie's Poirot, we find his demeanor amusing because he's so prissy and he's so fussy and he's so up his own arse half the time. But we love that about him. We love that about him, and that adds just that gentle note of humor in between his flashes of brilliance in solving crimes and the dark things that we're dealing with.
That's really interesting. I think I love Poirot, and I love his he's probably bordering on OCD, isn't he, with his eggs and his moustaches and, you know, but I think I find him fascinating. I find that whole sort of thing about him, because he is such a genius as well. I think he's got to have like a flaw as well, because otherwise he'd just be too perfect.
But he also comes from a very dark background as well, doesn't he? Because he was a Belgian refugee, and the awfulness of what happened in Belgium to drive him to English shores. And of course, Agatha Christie had met Belgian refugees in the hospital where she was working and heard some of the horror as well. So I guess that's also sort of lightening awfulness of the First World War, and as David was saying earlier, you know, these golden age writers, they'd lost people, some of them had been injured in the First World War, and seen such horrors, and I think that is part of their processing of their own horror, is the humour that comes out in the likes of Poirot, and also some of the others of that era as well. Very funny, very witty.
It is a way of coping with these things, but it's also entertaining, isn't it? It's fun to have a bit of humour, a bit of wit.
I think humour is quite often goes with darkness, doesn't it? It's like if you can't laugh, you know, you're going to cry. So it's sort of like bringing that in to sort of just soften things a bit. Actually, Sarah's just asked my next question, so I'm going to let Sarah answer this one, because I was going to ask you, do you have a favourite crime writer? She's asked, do you have a favourite author? So I'll let you decide which one you answer, or both. You could have both. You could be crime and a favourite author.
I'm working through all the Agatha Christie's. I got for Christmas, you know, the collected short stories, which is a massive, great big book. So I would have to say Agatha Christie at the moment, but that's, you know, next year when I finish them, it'll be somebody else I'm reading, I guess.
Of crime writers, my favourite is Dorothy, I'll say, as you might have guessed, because I've talked about her a lot already. But I also love Graham Greene, who I think is wonderful, both in the comedies and the thrillers, the entertainments that he calls his lighter works, like Travels with My Aunt, my favourite book of all time. And George Orwell for his directness and his politics, I guess, as well. But I read widely, and like David says, you know, and that's healthy, I think, as well. So I read a lot of children's and young adult stories. I read a lot of just been reading a lot of E. Nesbit, for example, who I'd forgotten how funny she was. You know, there's a lot of humour in there. But my Desert Island book would probably be Dorothy, I'll say, as the Nine Tailors, or Travels with My Aunt, maybe. Travels with My Aunt. Have to negotiate on that one, I think.
I think your favorite author changes over your lifetime, doesn't it? I mean, none of us maintain the same favorite author over a lifetime, generally speaking. I mean, when we're young, I was young, Terry Pratchett was my favorite author because I fell in love with the Discworld series, and I actually wrote a comic fantasy age 17 and sent it in and told my parents I'm not going to university because I'm going to be a rich and famous writer. And this is to Asian parents. This is to Asian parents, mind you. It didn't go anywhere because the book was shit and it was rejected, as it should be. My favorite crime writer is Michael Connelly. He writes the Harry Bosch novels. You know, I mean, he's one of the world's biggest selling writers. Read everything he's written, watched all the series, met him, lovely man. So for me, that was a huge career. You know, no matter how far you get in this industry, I think it's still a thrill to be able to meet your personal heroes, which was not a thing when I was young. There was no chance of me ever meeting Terry Pratchett. You know, there was no online Zoom sessions like this, or you know, even events that you could really go to. Certainly not somebody from a British Asian background, because we just didn't do fiction as a community. We just didn't. It just wasn't a thing, sadly. So yeah, it's still a thrill for me.
I think the hopeful answer is the next author you read.
Hopeful but very deluded.
Yeah, don't mind that.
It does. I mean, it does change, doesn't it? I mean, I think I read Agatha Christie young, but then didn't read her for years, and then had a real like binge on her about 5 years ago, and I love her again now. But she definitely wouldn't have been anywhere for probably 30 years. She wouldn't have been my favourite. But again, now I would probably say she's one of my favourites. I think that's probably more diplomatic, isn't it? But yeah, it does change. Laura's saying that Kenneth Branagh's depiction of Poirot does show more of his darker side very well, although she wasn't impressed by the butchering of Halloween Party. No, nor was I. In A Haunting in Venice. So I don't know if anybody's seen A Haunting in Venice, but it's my husband's going, it's an adaptation. It's an adaptation. I'm like, I don't like it.
I saw it. I quite enjoyed it. There was more than just the adaptation being butchered, because the mustache. I mean, what is that all about? That's not Poirot's mustache, is it? Come on, Kenneth. No, Kenneth, sit down, Kenneth, and shut up.
Yeah.
The last few David Suchet Poirots were very, very dark.
Oh yeah, I still haven't watched the one where he dies because I couldn't bear it. But
you know, that and the
brutal.
Express.
I cried.
Radically different from the first ones.
Do you want to know how he perfected his? I read this, so if you want a fun fact.
Yeah,
I know this.
The way that David Suchet perfect. You know, he has that little walk. So what David Suchet said is that what he did was he took a 2-penny coin, put it between his bottom cheeks, and he had to keep it in there while he walked. And he said that's how he got the walk right.
Brilliant.
You can look it up with me.
He wrote a wonderful memoir called Poirot, which is well worth reading. David Suchet, Poirot and Me. It's lovely. And Agatha Christie's, if you've never read Agatha Christie's autobiography as well, that's highly recommend that. And also on the subject of Agatha Christie, I recently discovered her books written as Mary Westmacott, which are not crime stories at all. And Absent in the Spring, they're a little bit, some are better than others, but Absent in the Spring, I highly recommend. It's nothing to do with Cosy Crime, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And she said that was the book that she wanted to write because she was trapped in this, in her publishers wanting more and more crime books, but she went off and wrote these as Mary Westmacott, and Absent in the Spring is wonderful.
I guess there is always that danger, isn't it? I think Conan Doyle was the same with Sherlock Holmes, wasn't it? They almost take over. They take over. You know, you create a monster in a way, and then people want more. And you become a slave to them then, rather than the other way around. And I don't know if it is true that Agatha Christie really didn't like Poirot. Come the end, you know, she tired of him. She killed him off, didn't she? And then carried on writing about him, but she knew he died, obviously. Sorry, there are people there if there's a spoiler, but he does die.
I think didn't she delay the publication? I think was that the one that she delayed the publication until after her own death.
I think she did for both. Yeah,
she was going to have it published posthumously, but when she couldn't write anymore, she brought that one out. I think in the last year of her life.
Well, Arthur Conan Doyle was the same about Sherlock Holmes. That's why he killed him off, because he came to hate the character, because he wanted to write more serious historical fiction, serious in his words. So he got so pissed off about people kept banging on about give us another Sherlock that he said, fine, I'm going to kill this idiot off. I don't think any of us could do this. You know, I get written so I haven't written. So my first series, the Baby Ganesh agency novels with Chopra and the Baby Elephant, I haven't written a book in that series, but I continue to get mail from people, and it's usually about it's threatening letters about making sure nothing bad happens to that damn elephant, who was never. And it's just a side character. It's not even a main in the books, but you know, somehow people have just fallen in love with that character, and now people get very invested in a character, because when Arthur Conan Doyle killed off Sherlock Holmes,
they do.
Oh, it caused a huge fuss, huge furore.
That people went around with black armbands.
That's right.
Holmes had died. Yeah. I get it from fans saying, I still haven't forgiven you for doing X. It's nice that people are invested in it, but you do sometimes feel, held up against the wall.
Definitely.
And they're going, get on with this.
Yeah. I had someone once tell me about Springtime for Murder. They said, you killed the wrong person. I thought, what? I wasn't quite sure what to make of that. I mean, it's drug addled. Yeah. So I don't know who they didn't say who they wanted me to kill. They weren't like voting for who to kill next, but it's quite interesting. But yeah, it's wonderful when you get that kind of.
I think as well is that when people, if you're mixing fiction and fact to a certain extent, that people can get quite precious about that. If you dare to cross the line of something, becoming fiction that was fact, or changing that. I mean, I'm a bit like it with Agatha Christie because I don't like them being changed. So I can see why people get. But I remember Alison Weir once saying about how she would write in things that weren't in fact. But then people would question and say, well, that didn't happen. Well, she said, but it did in my book because it's fiction. But it's very difficult, isn't it? That line of like, where does fact finish and fiction start?
But the clue's in the name there, really, isn't it? Historical fiction.
Exactly, yeah. I'm just looking at the time, and we're coming up to the end of our hour, which has gone really quickly. We're nearly at the shortest day, which for me is just amazing, and I really don't like the dark days and nights. Do you have a favourite winter book? Do you have a book that you return to in the winter? If it's not a book, is there a genre that you like reading in the winter?
I don't. I've got so many books to read. I rarely reread a book, but I don't think I've got a seasonal change.
I've got a
no. You don't
shelf.
Sort of go to win. You don't.
I've got a shelf of Christmassy books that I've been gathering over the years, and there are all sorts of things from Laurie Lee to Miss Reed, cozy books. But I have to say, Charles Christmas in Wales for a nice quick read. And I've got a lovely, lovely little hardback illustrated by Edward Darcy's Only, which is beautiful. And also Christmas Carol in all its forms. It's every year.
Yeah.
Not particular books, but I quite like a genre called uplit. I don't know if people are familiar with the idea, which is usually it's interesting character arc. It's usually a quirky character. It's not crime. It's usually a quirky character. Bad things happen.
Yeah.
It finishes on a positive note, so it's up. It's up at the end, but lots of dark stuff in the middle. So I've got a whole collection of books like that. Ellen Oliphant is completely fine. What have I got there? The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry, Saving Missy, all sorts of books like that. I quite like getting to. However, I mean, given the cost of it, A Man Called Over, I've got that as well. Yeah, might have to chuck some on the fire to heat the home these days, but just a joke. Nobody's burning books on a book channel.
Nobody's burning books. Just before we go, I've got Laura saying, Vaseem, it's huge. The moustache, is huge to hide Poirot's facial scars from World War I. I do remember that. That's in the second film where he has like a flashback, and it's because he's had some sort of he had I think he has a shell go off in his face or something. So that's what the answer is.
Fair enough.
And Laura's saying that Agatha Christie wrote the endings for Poirot and Marple in World War II and kept them in a safe in case she died in an air raid.
Oh, that's very thoughtful.
Which was very good of her. It was. Thank you so much for everybody for joining us. Thank you for bearing with the lag. I think we got there in the end. I don't think we all managed to find our way. But thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I've loved chatting to all three of you. And I've got some more books to add to my massive pile. I should be definitely checking them out. Thank you for joining us. The next chat is at 3:00, and it's with Janice Hallett and Abigail Burdess. So if you can join us then, please do. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye all.